Okay, the point of departure for my presentation are two books, which I'll briefly discuss in the beginning. The first one is Larry Wolff's Inventing Eastern Europe. It's quite an important book in the field of studies on the concepts of Central and Eastern Europe, and I think it's quite an interesting read, even if you want to fully understand the title of our conference, right? What does it mean, Eastern Europe? Why Central and Eastern Europe? Who out of the ones present here would like to be classified as Central Europe, and who would like to be classified as Eastern Europe? And so on, right? These are all very problematic and very political questions. Wolff's thesis is that this idea of Eastern Europe is basically an invention of the 18th century, which substituted the more traditional idea, functioning more or less since the Roman times, the division into the south and the north of Europe. The north of Europe being a sort of wilderness to be explored, and the south of Europe being the light and the source of culture. Wolff he starts by describing fragments from memoirs or diaries of people visiting the East, sometimes very peculiarly defined. For example, when Mozart goes from Vienna to Prague, he actually goes west, but in some other sense he goes east, right? He feels that he's going east even though he's going west. William Cox travels into Poland, Russia, Sweden, and Denmark. Denmark being included in the slightly wilder countries. The natives of Poland were poorer, humbler, and more miserable than any people we had yet observed in the course of our travels. Whenever we stopped, they flocked around us in crowds and, asking for charity, used the most abject gestures. This was one of the main attractions of these narratives, to describe the terrible living conditions, to describe the hovels which people live in. Basically, what we know right now from TV documentaries about the so-called Third World, right? Louis-Philippe de Ségur, who was a French emissary to the Empress Catherine, his memoirs were published in 1824, but actually the period he's writing about, the trip to Russia, happened by the end of the 18th century, right, I think it was several years before the French Revolution. But when one enters Poland, one believes one has left Europe entirely. A poor population enslaved, dirty villages, cottages little different from savage huts. Everything makes one think one has been moved back 10 centuries and that one finds oneself amid hordes of Huns, Scythians, Veneti, Slavs, and Sarmatians. And this is a trope that de Ségur uses several times in his memoirs, putting the population of the eastern countries alongside the barbarians, right? Quite clearly refashioning this older division, the south and the north, into a new sphere of reference. This is an older account. Adam Oliarius, a German scholar, who traveled to Russia in the 17th century. He's one of the predecessors of this more spectacular movement of describing the backwardness of Eastern Europe. When you observe the spirit, the mores, and the way of life of the Russians, you are bound to number them among the barbarians. Since they eat a great deal of garlic and onion, it is rather trying to be in their company. Perhaps against their will, these good people fart and belch noisily. Some are addicted to the vile depravity we call sodomy, and not only with boys, but also with men and horses. Such antics provide matter for conversation. Right? Quite clearly meant to impress the readers with the spectacular details. But then there is something that I think is much more telling. This was just anecdotal. Since the Russians are by nature cruel and fit only for slavery, they must constantly be kept under a cruel and harsh yoke of restraint and driven to work with cudgels and whips. They scarcely show displeasure with this, since their condition requires it and they are accustomed to it. Now and then the young bastards get together and strike each other in order to make such treatment a habit, part of their second nature, so that they may bear it more easily. And this is something that Wolff very much capitalizes on. The need to discipline Eastern Europe and the way in which Eastern Europe is accustomed to being disciplined, right? It's a mutually beneficial undertaking, and one of the icons, especially when Russia is being described, one of the iconic items that are always mentioned is the whip, right? The so-called knut, this typical Russian whip, which some of the travelers even brought back as a souvenir, right, to show what kind of tool is used in these lands. So much for Larry Wolff for the moment. And now Vesna Goldsworthy, who wrote another very important book, Inventing Ruritania, The Imperialism of the Imagination. Wolff also provided a sort of groundwork for this book by saying a very important thing, that many of these writers describing the Eastern Europe in the 18th century, people like Voltaire, for instance, did not necessarily feel the need to actually go there, right? So these are very often imagined narratives of Eastern Europe. And Goldsworthy concentrates on this. Ruritania is a fictitious country from Anthony Hope's famous novel, The Prisoner of Zenda. Actually, Hope did not intend Ruritania to represent to necessarily represent an Eastern European country, but it's somewhere near Austria and so on. So ultimately, Ruritania became a catchphrase that was mainly associated with the Balkans. And Goldsworthy concentrates on the Balkans, and she introduces this term literary colonization, right, or imperialism of the imagination. The process of literary colonization is not unlike real colonization. It begins with travel writers, explorers and adventurers undertaking reconnaissance missions. They deliver the first news. They are gradually followed by novelists, playwrights and poets. Once mapped, new territories are further appropriated by the writers of popular fiction, who delineate the final shape of the imaginary map and secure the stakes as surely as European colonists secured newly surveyed parcels of land in America, Australia or New Zealand. At this point, they and their collaborators in the film industry can begin the full commercial exploitation of the appropriated territory. So these cultural images serve as a sort of commodity that is saleable, and they derive profit from it. And Goldsworthy says it seems to be quite an innocent procedure, but then, as she argues, for example, in the case of the Balkans, it very strongly influences the way in which a country is perceived, and then the questions of foreign aid, of its political status, and so on. Right? So it's also in this respect it mirrors real colonization. Here is a list of fictitious countries, most of them mentioned by Goldsworthy in her book, but not all of them. You can see how interesting and easy it was to invent Balkan countries or Eastern European countries, right? A whole list. Some of the names are quite well known, some a bit less so. All of them are from her book except for the last one, David Edgar, and it actually has to do with my main field of research, which is contemporary British drama. He's a dramatist who wrote a trilogy about the 1989-1990 changes, and in each of them he invents a country. For some of these countries he even invents languages, right? So quite a lot of work that he put into it. And this is what I'm going to be interested in this presentation. Fictitious countries invented for the purposes of video games. The first case that I know of is from Infocom's text adventure Border Zone. The name of the country is Frobnia, which is quite clearly an allusion to the Frobos electric company from the Zork adventure games. I don't know if it will be visible. It's basically a spy thriller, and I think from the point of view of cultural studies, the game itself is a bit less interesting than the manual and the feelies, the additional material that Infocom added to their games. Here you have a little dictionary, right, of Frobnian. Walking on the street, you will use many friendly words, says this guide. Like excuse me, which in Frobnian is oopsie daisy, right? They are, and so on in continuous most of these enumerations end with the most useful phrase here, which is "you're under arrest." Right? This is the basic phrase which ends almost in every page here. Okay, the captions for the photos are also quite interesting. Whether you are a convention, whatever that means, whether you are a convention, Frobnia's several clean hotels are able to promise you plentiful beds with sufficient rations of pillows and blankets. Right? This is something that actually has a very good counterpart in British literature. Malcolm Bradbury's novel Rates of Exchange, in which he invented a country called Slaka, based partly on Bulgaria and Romania. He also invented a language for Slaka, the main. It's basically a game manual that alludes to, or perhaps not alludes to, but is very similar to Malcolm Bradbury's fictional guide, Why Come to Slaka. I'll skip over this border zone thing. The most interesting game, I think, that I'm going to talk about is the game Ashes of Empire, 1992, designed by the famous Mike Singleton of Lords of Midnight fame. This is an excerpt from the manual, which I won't read out loud. You can take a look at it. It seems to be very serious, right? In Ashes of Empire, you will find echoes of the real world, and I hope echoes of how delicate a task it is to bring peace and prosperity to lands where there is, at the moment, only hardship, bloodletting, and misery. Wishing you success in your mission of mercy, Mike Singleton. The basic plot of this game is based on, there is a group of post-Soviet countries, and then something goes very wrong, as you can see in the pictures. The most interesting thing is how this crisis is supposed to be solved. It's a bit like the game Just Cause. I don't know if the creators of Just Cause realized how much they are similar to Mike Singleton's old games. But there is a one-man army representing an unnamed Western agency, a guy who can, at a moment's notice, get a bomber or a fighter plane or a tank or a car. And he moves around these republics, called, for example, Servonia, right, Moldania, Belokraine, Ossia, Ruzakstan. What he does is he destroys the local armies and he bribes the local leaders. You can see here, Matteo, the manager, is at work in the bomb-proof warehouse. He says he will join your site if you will deliver a barrel of wine and a case of medication. Right, and this is how you enlist these people to your cause, and then in this way you bring order. You have to also get control of some military installations, destroy some military installations. There is a quota of how many you have to deal with in each province. And this is how this peacekeeping works. And notice how nicely it ties in with what Larry Wolff described. The idea of disciplining the East, right? There is a guy from the West who comes and who teaches them what is what, right? Teaches them by very questionable methods, by killing some of them, by bribing others. And this is how this mission of mercy works. I don't think I have time to discuss Republic the Revolution. It also has a very patronizing view of post-Soviet republics. You might have, this is a quasi-political simulator, which is sort of, functionally it's more like a board game. It also has a very patronizing view of the East, right? There is a Commissar fried chicken chain, part of a notorious chain of fried chicken shops. The special coating of herbs and spices dates back to Battle of Stalingrad and has a distinct flavor of diesel oil, which was used to fry the chicken. Almost offensive. If you change Stalingrad for the siege of Leningrad, it would be terribly offensive, right? But as it stands, it's also quite offensive. And the idea is also that the East is basically a territory of chaos that you have to discipline. And to cut a long story short, my conclusion is that even though there are not too many games concerned with the East in this way, it seems to be a very good subject for games. If it's inherently a space of total chaos, and a space that waits for agency in a way, right? It's always a passive space in these games, and there is a single agent, us, who bring order to it, who discipline it, who destroy what has to be destroyed and helps whoever needs to be helped. It's a great setting for a sandbox game, right? You couldn't imagine a better setting. And paradoxically, the more civilized the East becomes, the less attractive it is as a subject for video games. There is a very strong parallel between these kind of games and games dealing with fictitious Southern American countries. And I think this is where the focus has shifted, right? From older games like Hidden Agenda to the Just Cause series or to the Tropico series. This is a territory right now that you can more innocently imagine and patronize, and which you can discipline in a video game. So in these respects, we're becoming less and less interesting, with some exceptions, like paradoxically a Czech game, right? Arma 2 with Chernarus, of course. This is an important example. And interestingly, Arma 2 becoming DayZ ultimately, right? Another place of wilderness which has to be somehow, I mean, you can't ultimately bring order to it, but this is what you're trying to do, right? To create little islands of order in total chaos. This is what the idea of DayZ is. So I suppose this is how the trope of Eastern Europe works in video games. Thank you for your attention.